Lahai-Roi Act III was, for me, a very odd experience. In many ways, Kuro gave us exactly what I've been asking for, exactly what I've argued they're capable of all along. But it was built upon a character archetype I've never really cared for, so I was left on the outside looking in. The vast majority of people adored this story, and with good reason. I did not, but while there were many details which bothered me, even in the moment I could see how they took the core of each chapter I had loved in the past and combined them all together. Let's explore what makes this story so well done that even someone who didn't enjoy the experience can appreciate the art, and why I still think they can do better. To give a little context, let's start with a related question which comes up when I critique parts of WuWa's story I did not enjoy. If you don't like the game, why do you play it? I started because I was excited for an open-world science fantasy epic with fun combat and an engaging narrative. The premise felt like exactly what I had been dreaming of. I loved science fantasy, and open-world games with a cinematic story are easily my favorites. The presentation was amazing right from the first moment, and while there were many issues early on, I felt that if the story could live up to its presentation, this game could become something special. Instead, over time, my excitement faded. The updates weren't bad, but the story didn't capture my imagination in the way I'd hoped, the characters didn't capture my heart, and by the end of version 1, I kinda lost interest. It was still a good game, but perhaps just not for me. Then came Renacita. It started fairly well, and from an exploration perspective, it addressed most of the issues which had left me disappointed during version 1, and before long I saw hints that the story might reach its full potential. Kartathia's quest was perhaps predictable and cliché, but it came across as a truly heartfelt story, told with a focus on character growth and depth of emotion which swept me away. Lupus took a different approach, a more complex narrative which slowly revealed a timeline split across several iterations, which still managed to make the characters likable and the moment-to-moment experience compelling. And Frollova's was a fascinating exploration of an uncompromising villain whose tragic backstory explained her actions without justifying, and most importantly, who challenged our protagonist and forced us to question their morals and motivations for the first time. It still had room for improvement, and these are the kinds of things I expect of any good story, but for a good half a year, WuWa's execution was fantastic. If they had kept that up, I'd have been ecstatic. And if they'd taken the strengths of each of those stories and built them into a cohesive tale with a wider scope than just one patch, then it could become that something special I had glimpsed in its early presentation. I did not expect that level of quality every time, but as I've covered previously, I was still disappointed with the rest of Renacita despite its peak presentation. For me, the underlying story did not live up to its promise. I hope that, with a fresh start in Lahai-Roi, they would set things up to recapture those heights, but as I covered in my last two videos, Acts 1 and 2 both frustrated me, though in wildly different ways. That's not because I hate the game, it's because I think they can do better. After all, they did in the past. I kept playing because I had hoped they would recapture that spark and maybe even take it further than they had before. And since they seemed to put in far more effort for each region's Sentinel Resonator, I was especially curious how they'd handle Aemeath. As I hinted in the intro, unlike seemingly everyone else, I did not like her. I'll explain why in a little more detail later on, but in brief, the way she was presented in the first half of the quest leaned too much into a character archetype I cannot stand, and unfortunately, the second half couldn't quite save her for me. And since she was the heart and soul of the story, that meant I did not enjoy the experience. However, there are a lot of aspects to the story which I think deserve a lot of praise. Let's start with the smaller ones and work towards the biggest. First, Act 3 avoids some of the key pitfalls which had made me frustrated with Acts 1 and 2, and provides a kind of introduction to Lahai-Roi and the people within it which I'd wanted from the start. We're introduced to 3 new characters, Sigrica, Nivora, and Lucille, and each is used in a different way, with different levels of involvement in the story which felt appropriate. Their presence made the world feel just that little bit more like an active community made up of people, rather than just cardboard cutout NPCs. And it also continued the presence and the story relevance of 2 of the important characters from earlier acts. Mornier showed up for a brief moment to help move the plot along, while Luke played a much more significant part and tagged along with us for a good hour or so of the quest. Some people seem to hear characters just disappear from the story as a cry for them to merely show up, kinda how Mornier did here. What we're actually asking for is their stories to continue outside of their moment in the spotlight. Luke's part in this quest was far more significant than the kind of level we're talking about without ruining Aemeath's story, and more importantly, it continued his story and set things up for future acts as well. Much of the early parts of this quest had me just wondering why this kind of introduction barely happened in the introduction to the region. I also thought that once we got past the introduction, the concept for the first half of the quest was pretty cool. Aemeath is a digital ghost, and we must search for shards of her soul scattered across the region so she can piece herself back together. When she's recovered her power, she'll be able to interact with the world once more after a decade of living as a ghost. It's a cool idea, which makes the most of the sci-fi concept behind her situation, a great excuse for us to wonder about the world and for us to learn about different slices of her past. This is a great example of setting up a promise, providing progress towards our goals, and giving a payoff at the end. I don't think they made the most of this idea, which we'll explore later on, but the concept itself is a good one and their execution was solid. I also think that little moment with the astronaut deserves a shout out for making the most of the ever-present binary dialogue options. We explore a space station which fell to the planet long ago and has been undisturbed under the ice sheets ever since. As we delve deeper, we eventually unlock a sealed section and discover that everything inside has been corrupted by void matter. The void matter should have spread out and contaminated the rest of the station and beyond, yet it has been locked in and we found out why. A lone astronaut had regained consciousness after the crash, realized he was infected, and used his last moments to seal the corruption away from the rest of the world. At the end of this brief section, we get the usual dual dialogue options, except here they do something different. Most of the time, dialogue options in games like WuWa make so little difference that they almost feel like they're just checking that you're still paying attention to the game. This time, each option presents a different interpretation of the story we had just witnessed. Did he know everyone else in the station was already dead and seal the void matter away to avoid corrupting the wider world? Or did he think his friends and colleagues were still alive and act in the hopes of saving them? Either interpretation makes sense, and they're each tragic in their own way. Presenting them as a question, asking us to put ourselves into the astronaut's perspective, made the story just that little bit more real. I enjoyed the world building throughout the space station exploration sequence, and this moment towards the end really topped it off. But far more importantly, the central narrative trusted the audience to follow a more ambitious tale with its progressive reveal of the time loop which circumscribed Aemeath's existence. Time travel is one of those aspects of science fiction which can cause an entire story to unravel if it's not done well, and it takes a lot of skill to set things up in a way which is both engaging to experience and coherent and logical once you have a full understanding of every step along the way. I particularly like it when they lean into the paradox side of things. For example, Predestination is an underrated favourite of mine because it really goes hard on that. Aemeath's is similar, a closed loop which evokes questions of destiny, fate, and free will. Here, the time loop was presented more as a payoff to all the setup which had come before, an explanation which satisfies all the little hints and questions which had been left open. I'd argue the story's focus was more on Aemeath's emotional journey, the revelations about Rover's past, and setting up her sacrifice rather than the time travel itself. As someone who generally appreciates character-focused stories, this is usually an approach I'd love, and they undeniably did this type of story justice. It's just a shame I wasn't into her personally, and even though all the revelations in the second half softened my perspective of her, it didn't quite save it for me. In contrast to the astronaut's engaging but self-contained story, Sigillum's part in the plot turned out to have huge implications which stretch far beyond this single chapter. It showed up throughout the first half of the quest as an antagonist, a rogue mech trying to interfere with us, somehow siphoning off some of Rover's frequencies with every encounter. In the final confrontation, we learn Sigillum took form from a fragment of Rover's frequency which Aemeath discovered and nurtured, corrupted by the void in her moment of weakness. The truth she learned was seismic. Rover is from a different planet entirely and travelled to Sol 3 along with the Sentinels on a mission to save the world. Their mission was one they were given, not one they chose. And most importantly, they desperately wanted to go home, even just to glimpse it from afar. But this wish was coldly rejected by their authorities. I particularly liked how they solved Aemeath's dilemma here. She wanted to hide the truth from Rover to spare them from their pain, from their compulsion to save the world. But Rover pointed out that even without those memories, they chose to wander far and wide and spend all their time saving people because that's simply who they are. These tiny scraps of extra context add so much to the Rover. It echoes one half of what made Frolova's quest so good. It turns our protagonist into something more than just blank slate self-insert superhero by giving them an inherent internal conflict and motivation beyond the nebulous savior trope. And with that in mind, another small moment I want to highlight is an interesting contradiction between current Rover's words and past Rover's actions, which should hopefully set up some future exploration of their perspective. At the climax, Rover tells Aemeath, "Things only weigh on you because they matter." This philosophy neatly summarizes Rover's perspective and aligns really well with the actions we've seen them take so far. It felt like a core belief, so fundamental to who they are that they'd never needed to say it out loud before. And yet, past Rover deleted their own memories. That is the polar opposite of this philosophy. They cast away everything that mattered to them and left themselves bereft of meaning. Up until this moment, I was curious about why they'd wipe their memories, but it felt like some distant action in the half-forgotten past, which didn't really have much meaning for the story. This single line of dialogue highlights that contradiction, and it feels like a promise. Whatever drove them to do something so contrary to everything they believe in, it cannot be something small. And then, at the end, Aemeath's self-sacrifice fulfills the other half of what I loved about Frolover's quest, a moral challenge to Rover's perspective. In Frolover's case, the two of them completely disagree and clash together over their incompatible moral perspectives as they try to work together. This time, the challenge comes from a completely different angle. Aemeath agrees with Rover and follows the same path, and that forces Rover to see the other side. Rover is forever sacrificing themselves in the pursuit of the greater good, taking on the burden of saving people even though it hurts, and more importantly, even though it hurts the others who care about them. They refuse to try any other way and argue that since they can do these things, they have to do them. Aemeath's savior complex is a direct result of her wanting to emulate Rover, and she ends up in a position where she is the one who can save the world, and therefore she feels she has to do so. Rover realizes this too late to stop her, and now they're forced to confront the dark side of their own decisions. That is genuinely great storytelling. And finally, one last thing I loved was that final cutscene with Aemeath's paper plane floating across the academy on a gentle breeze. Much like Aemeath herself, it passed unnoticed through those simple, unheralded slices of life. When she had been alive, she made a point to try everything she could, to experience anything and everything around her. As a ghost, she had haunted these same scenes, working towards a way to make sure they could continue to exist. This cutscene felt like an affirmation that even the most basic, simple moment is worth saving. Life is something to be cherished. A fitting note to end on. One aspect which always drums up some discussion, but which I'd place as neither positive nor negative, is the question of introducing gameplay within the quests. Some want as much gameplay as possible, some want none at all, and a spectrum exists in between. Personally, I prefer something in the middle, an interactive movie with moments of gameplay to keep it engaging. The interactive movie part is one of the reasons I always had such high hopes for WuWa. Its presentation actually matches what I'd always wanted. The one-off gameplay in these quests can often feel a little gimmicky, a little bit like filler, and at its worst it can be really janky, but as long as it has some purpose in the narrative, it doesn't waste too much time, I don't mind it all that much. What bothers me in all these games, however, is how they insist on introducing new concepts or enemies or characters you might not have played with before at the climactic moment of their stories. This fight against Sigillum had the presentation, emotional stakes, and narrative twists which should have made it an iconic experience, but its momentum was tanked for me by the time spent figuring out what the hell I was supposed to do to counter Sigillum's attacks. There is sadly no easy answer here. They could use familiar enemy mechanics in the final confrontation, but then the battle would risk feeling too familiar, too safe. When the goal is for the fight to feel meaningful, that would be just as disappointing. In this particular case, for me the boss fights were more or less fine, while the gameplay sections in the space station maybe overstayed their welcome just a little. So, given all those clear positives, what could possibly have made me so unmoved by Aemeath herself that it ruined the experience for me? And does it mean I think she's a badly written character? As we piece everything together, we discover that she was basically great at everything. She was a top student who excelled in all her classes without really trying. She was a skilled pilot, a speed queen on her bike, and an exceptional synchronist with unusually high scores in all her tests. She was popular amongst her peers, and in her spare time, she was a talented singer-songwriter whose alias became a campus legend. She's shown to be emotionally intelligent and perceptive, deeply loyal and protective, kind, funny, and not to mention modest about her accomplishments. You might expect me to follow that up by saying, and therefore she's a textbook Mary Sue, but I don't think she is, for reasons we'll get to in a minute. Instead, I think the root of why she just does not appeal to me is in how she relates to one of my pet peeves in the real world. I hate the way people idolize natural talent and devalue the effort people put in to achieve their goals. The vast majority of people at the top of their fields will have put in monumental effort even if they were naturally talented in the first place, yet all that effort gets dismissed as unimportant. Many aspects of Aemeath's presentation grated against that for me, and her singing is the perfect example. She has an entire fan fan club celebrating her work a decade after she disappeared, and yet it's brushed off as something she's just dabbled with in her spare time, not something she was even particularly passionate about. When that's the pattern for everything about a character, I end up feeling like the author is just trying to manipulate me into liking their creation. I lose my immersion in the story, which is incredibly frustrating, and I end up disliking the character as a result. I find much more personality in someone who pours their heart and soul into something. Hell, it would have been interesting if her motivation had been that she craves being the center of attention, a perfect fit for her abandonment issues, and giving her a character trait often seen as a flaw would have been an interesting dimension. Instead, every aspect of her personality came across as she's the best girl. For me, talent without effort doesn't feel earned, and a character who excels at everything without caring about any of it gives me nothing to hold on to. For all the people who bought into it, however, this was a fantastic way to set up everyone for a devastating heartbreak later on. Despite that huge barrier preventing me from connecting to Aemeath, even in the first half of the quest, I did not see her as a Mary Sue. For one thing, her whole situation as a digital ghost existed because she had failed in her attempt at being a hero in the past, and she paid a heavy price for it. The framing of the story made it pretty clear that while they were going out of their way to showcase her virtues, there would be something about her which turned that on its head once we saw beneath the surface. She doesn't have that uncanny ability to solve every problem put in front of her with the barest effort, and while her bubbly personality in the first half might make it seem like she was completely unfazed by her isolation, there were little moments which showed something more. Her habit of waving at people to pretend she gets some human interaction, for example, though I do wish those had included some moments where she wasn't endlessly cheerful. And when we see the truth inside her mindscape, it's clear just how broken she truly is. There's a bitter, almost unhinged edge to her inner self, as she clearly struggles to deal with the situation she finds herself in and the truths about Rover's past that she discovered. Her overwhelming rage at Rover's treatment and her pained laughter at the unfairness of it all when she retells the story felt perfectly in keeping with everything else about her to me. I've also seen a few people say they think the depth of her connection with the rover as a child was unrealistic since she latched onto them so quickly and they didn't seem to have that much time together in the end. Once again, I disagree. Many children take their parents for granted, sure, but Aemeath's parents died and she felt disconnected from those around her. A lost, lonely, traumatized child would hero worship someone who saved their life and treated them with kindness, and once that bond was given time to grow, it's natural that it would become a lasting, deep connection. The scenes showing Aemeath's childhood were cute, and it's clear why their time together would be such a powerful core memory for her, and lead to everything about the person she eventually became. I do wish they'd shown a little more of her perspective, especially in the time after Rover left. It would have underlined just how traumatic that final abandonment must have felt. The one person she'd come to trust after losing everything, gone forever. Given their connection, it puts Rover's decision to wipe their memory in a whole new light. Not only did they essentially abandon their child, but they went and deleted all memory of them entirely. The explanation for that decision will be interesting to see once we finally get to that point. Overall, even as someone who feels next to no connection to her as a person, I think she's a well-crafted character with an interesting story and an emotional depth which stands out. However, since I wasn't swept away by the story, I couldn't help but notice a bunch of missed opportunities or other flaws which I'd imagine passed most people by. The first was how they handled Aemeath's invisibility. For one thing, they skipped past the possibility of having some fun moments before Rover understands the situation, where we would assume others can see her too. At the end of that first scene, Lucille explains who Aemeath was, and it's instantly clear what's going on. It makes sense to get the story going quickly, given how much ground they had to cover, but I still wish they'd taken a little more time to explore that side of things. It's the kind of thing they could have included if they'd rearranged things just a little and invested some time seeding Aemeath's mystery in the earlier acts as well. And then, many conversations in the first half of the quest included Rover talking to someone and Aemeath interjecting with her perspective. I couldn't help but visualize how that came across to the people there who couldn't see her. There would be these awkward pauses all over the place. Luke pausing for 30 seconds, just long enough for Aemeath to interject with her commentary before finishing his sentence, was especially jarring. Given the limitations of the format, I imagine they would have struggled to make the lines of dialogue actually interrupt other characters, and if they had, it would have risked being a little hard to follow. They could have just given some throwaway explanation for this. For example, Rover could have claimed to have some helper on the line listening in and providing help, which would have been a perfect excuse for their behavior and introduced some interesting interactions where the other characters would try to say something to this supposed assistant, and Rover would relay Aemeath's response. In the end, this aspect obviously didn't bother many people, so that may have been effort better spent elsewhere. And when it comes to the premise of collecting the shards of a digital ghost soul, I still wish they'd done a little more with it. I feel like the Aemeath we met right at the start of the story was her full, whole self, and the intent was for us to slowly discover that her cheerful presentation is just a facade, until by the end we understand the depths of her emotion. This works, especially if you like her as a character, and there's nothing wrong with it per se. But her story would have hit me harder if the memories we've recovered along the way had changed her as well. That would have required her to be a little different at the start, not quite her full self, but the payoff at the end would have been great. That moment where she says it's okay that she's dead because it means she won't forget her friends would have hit even harder because she would have been recovering those parts of her past at the same moment. In the story we got, her cheerful facade was perhaps a little too perfect for me to really buy into it, and I wish they'd at least had some tiny moments where we see her face fall when no one's watching. And I found it particularly jarring that her one night spent as a person who can actually interact with the world around her once more was spent at a fan party for her pop star persona, since it had been made clear singing and performing wasn't a true passion for her, just something she dabbled in. I feel like they wanted to use this moment in the story to emphasize that her existence was meaningful to many people, that she had touched their lives, and her return was cause for celebration, a homecoming which let her feel part of the world one last time before she set off to make her grand sacrifice. My problem with this particular choice is that it meant she had no personal connection to anyone around her. They were all strangers, people who had appreciated her idol art but who never knew her. There were multiple people at the academy who would have known her before she disappeared. Her teachers, any fellow students who had since become faculty members themselves, other staff who she would have interacted with. She's also half Roya, so even though she never felt at home with them, there'd surely be some people who'd care that she returned. This made what should have been an emotional peak of the story feel a little bit disconnected to me, and then the sacrifice which came straight after was less impactful than it could have been. But either way, I haven't seen a single person mention this aspect at all, so I guess what we got worked for everyone else, and regardless, this is a fantastic cliffhanger on which to end Aemeath's chapter of the story. It's been interesting to see people act like the success of this story invalidates all of the critiques people had made about WuWa's wider storytelling issues. I think it's at least partly an obstinate refusal to understand what people are actually criticizing. We say, I wish the character stories would continue beyond the brief time in which they are being sold to us, and they interpret that as, I want all the characters to be there for every chapter even when that does not make any sense. And of course, they never stop to think that perhaps they misunderstood the whole discussion. Kuro were always going to pour a ton of effort into the introduction of the new Sentinel Resonator, so Aemeath having a fantastic story does not actually address any of that at all. There are signs that they are addressing those actual complaints. The way they've handled Luke so far has been promising. Mornier's connection to Rover implies we'll get more depth from her eventually. Lucille's introduction set her up to be interesting as well, and we're finally getting some more dimensions to Rover too. The end of Act 3 gives Rover a personal goal, with emotional stakes which truly matter, exactly the kind of thing an introduction to a story is supposed to set up. But the bigger question remains unanswered. Will watching Aemeath mirror their own choices back at them actually change how Rover moves through the world? We'll surely find some way to bring Aemeath back, perhaps in a climactic battle where we set out to confront Aleph 1 in void space. Without doubt, it will be absolute cinema. When we do, if they don't confront this moral contradiction, Aemeath's sacrifice would feel cast aside, its meaning dismissed. Kuro have set up some interesting promises, but they've done that before and left them unfulfilled. Hopefully, this time will be different. Looking back at the 3 quests in Renacita, which showed what this game could be, each gave us something distinct. Kartathea gave us heart, Lupa gave us complexity, Frolova gave us a protagonist who was challenged and changed. Aemeath's story is, in many ways, the synthesis of all 3. A heartfelt emotional journey, a complex layered structure, and a moral challenge which hits the Rover harder than anything which came before. And yet, despite all that, I wasn't moved by her in the way almost everyone else has been. There were perhaps moments where the narrative could have landed for me in spite of that, but for whatever reason, they didn't do that. What really matters is what comes next. Rover has a personal goal with real emotional stakes for perhaps the first time, and crucially, they've now felt the consequences of their own self-sacrificing nature from the other side. Whether that changes anything about how they move through the world will be the true test of whether Aemeath's story meant something lasting or was simply an isolated peak. Until next time.